yoke with the overall purpose of nation building. So this we can overcome by this siloed functioning, where small bits and pieces of the workload is all that is known by those rules, rather than the overall outcome of what we are aiming for. The other thing that we in the Capacity Building Commission are focusing on is action-based learning. As adults, the attention span for classroom learning is very limited. So one of our targets was that whatever is being taught or is being trained, it should result in an action in the field of actual position of that officer. And through this action learning, the officer is able to report back on the steps that he or she has taken on this. Some of the good practices we have studied are from Singapore, for example, where they have already analyzed that classroom training only provides 10% of the learning. 70% is experiential on the job, and enhancing the 70% experiential learning on the job through the iGOT platform and through online learning modules and through peer-to-peer learning. That's one of the best ways in which the Singapore Civil Service invests in their civil servants. So we looked at the national training policy. Do any of you know that there is a national training policy which governs our overall parameters? So this policy came into being in 2012. And unfortunately, it has not been implemented. So we are now in the Capacity Building Commission is in the process of transforming this. So the first objective is training to develop professional, impartial, and efficient civil service. And this, as I told you, we are making it to be aligned towards more citizen-centric and community-oriented in terms of the training objectives. Then the training institutes have to become models of excellence. So here in the training institutes, we have also talked about peer-to-peer learning and better adult learning principles, and not simply just training, but better adult learning pedagogy in that. And a single platform for learning, which we talked about, is the iGOT platform, which is coming up, and the content development will come from the CTIs, but anybody can take this training from there, from the iGOT platform. On the demand side, we want to create demand for each and every civil servant. There are 3 million Government of India civil servants and roughly 20 million civil servants, if we combine all the state services, are going right down to Gram Sevak and Talati level and health workers. So we are aiming that each ministry or department has a demand for training by preparing a capacity building plan, which will identify the competencies of each official there, what are the gaps, and the plan will be an annual plan where they overcome these competency gaps through training programs which are provided online or through classroom and CTS. So three examples I will tell you of. One is for the Union Territory Police Forces. A training program with the National Police Academy is now planned to provide more proactive problem-solving training to the police forces of all the union territories, being facilitated by the Capacity Building Commission. And the aim here is to improve the interaction between citizen and the police person. Common situations where this leads to friction are being identified, and those situations are then simulated so that the police personnel is trained to react in a pre-trained manner and not in an irritation or a reactive manner to those situations. In the Department of Posts, there are more than 215,000 Gramin Dak Sevaks, and they provide not only the postal services, which are not so important now, but they also provide financial inclusion services. They provide a mobile ATM. So they have been taken up now for identifying the training needs of these 2.15 lakh Gramin Dak Sevaks and making them more pro-citizen. The Ministry of Railway is the other example which we have started, and I'll tell you a little bit more about the Ministry of Railways. The Ministry of Railways, we first went towards finding out a holistic plan for the railways. So we looked at what is the vision of the Honorable Prime Minister for India, that is the $5 trillion economy and having an ease of living. Then we found out from there, we discussed with the railways, which part of the railways provides citizen-centric services to them. And then what is the technology required to upgrade them? And within that, what are the training programs that they could take in the next 1 year, which will transform the citizen-facing elements of the vast railway network. So we have taken up 5-6 departments, but in railways, the idea was the improvement in the quality of citizen interaction with with the citizens and the railways. So the main task was to institutionalize Bhartiya Rail as a brand synonymous with quality and consistent services. And you might not be knowing that 22 million Indians who every day interact with railways either use them as passengers or parcel services. So it's basically to undertake soft skills and behavioral training for these railway frontline staff. That the training program is being now rolled out. And we also documented what is the extent of time that citizens interface with these citizen-facing civil servants. So commercial clerks have 40 seconds to 4 minutes, or ticket collectors have roughly 30 seconds to 12 minutes interaction, and station masters 10 seconds to 2 minutes. Why this timing is important? Because it is in this 10 seconds of interaction with station master that a citizen makes an opinion about the entire railways, that the railway staff is not very polite, for example, if their interaction is bad. So we are simulating the interaction situations for all these categories and then ensuring that they are reacting in these situations in a way in which the citizen comes out with a pleasant feeling that I have been responded to favorably. So, and this is drawn from some of the best examples of railways. For example, the Swiss railways have an online platform which encourage these types of learnings. So let me sort of, in a way, end with saying that this the aim of most ATIs, because the central training institutions are much more focused at the ministerial level, but the ATIs, the state level administrative training institutions, train officers who are directly facing the civil services and the citizens. So how should the interaction be? This is the modulation for that. What we need is a government employee which has skills and capabilities and the right environment and right enablers for self-development. And a citizen needs better quality of life and ease of doing business. So the act of engagement should be such that the citizen is treated as an individual, not as a faceless plural, and that we are responsive to their needs and are able to solve the problems proactively that they bring to us. There were 2 films at the end of this. Films again? Origin. Manish, would you like to speak, and then I'll just organize the films. You'll be using a presentation. Huh? Okay. इसको निकाल लिया. हाँ, मैं लोड कर.
Thanks, Praveen. So one of the most interesting quotes in the pandemic that I read was from Jonas Salks. He's the inventor of the polio vaccine. He says, the most important question to ask yourself is, are you being a good ancestor? And I think we should imagine India at 100, because obviously the topic of this, at least this session, is transforming India's future and thinking about public solutions to quality of life. So what will India be at 100? Hopefully. 90% of Indians work outside farms, 50% of women work in the paid labor force. Today, it's only 25%. We have 350 cities with more than 1 million people. Today, we only have 52 cities. 70% of education spending is by the government. Today, it's only 40%. And 70% of health spending is by the government. Today, it's only 20%. And I didn't say it's school delivery, I said school spending, because one of the most embarrassing numbers in India is only 40% of our kids in government schools. Japan has only 4% of its kids in government schools. America only has 15%. If anything should be at free at quality in India, it should be education. But how will we get there? Who will do this work is more important than how this work will get done. Will it be the government? Will it be NGOs? Will it be the private sector? And that's absolutely the wrong question to be asking, right? I mean, it wasn't God's will that it should take 72 years for 1.3 billion Indians to cross the GDP of 63 million Britishers. You know, we crossed Britishers' GDP 2 years ago. It was because we got the balance wrong between the government, the private sector, and nonprofits. We got their roles muddled. We got their sort of structure mixed up. And there are no saints or sinners here. The government may have an execution deficit, the private sector has a trust deficit, and nonprofits have a scale deficit. So it's important to put that on the table. You know, I'm a private sector person, and you know, Einstein once said that if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its life believing it's stupid. So I am quite clear that my private sector effectiveness comes from my ability to make choices. You know, 3 are very important choices. I can choose my team, I can punish or reward my team, and I can make procurement without an L1 tender where a Dhobi Nai gets chosen for, you know, software. So I wanted to put that up front. I mean, many of you face constraints that I don't. But you also have to think about gravity. You know, gravity applies to all of us. I mean, performance is not all art. There is a lot of science. And so I think if you want to think about transforming India's future with public solutions, it is about innovation in public systems, you know, not more cooks in the kitchen, but a different recipe. And the only way you get not more cooks in the kitchen, but a different recipe is human capital. But please don't reduce human capital to training, because human capital includes training, it includes strategy, it includes staffing, it includes structure, it includes performance management, and most importantly, it includes tone from the top. But since this is a regional conference of institutions, let me say the 6 things that I think are most important when you think about training. The first one is what is delivered. Please make it demand-driven rather than supply-driven. Just because you have faculty or courses, don't do those courses, do the courses that matter. How is it delivered? There are 4 distinct classrooms: online, on-site, on-job, and on campus. All 4 have different efficacies, you know, depending on whether you're doing repair, whether you're doing prepare, or whether you're doing upgrade. Those are completely 3 different thought worlds. In fact, I believe soft skills can't be taught, they are caught. You know, you try to teach soft skills in a formal environment, they are caught in an informal environment. Who delivers? Who is the faculty? You know, Mr. Chaturvedi earlier talked about, you know, performers being good faculty, because you can't spend your whole life writing your autobiography. There's nothing to write about. You have to do something and then write about it, right? So I think that the messenger and message is really important when you talk about who delivers. How it is evaluated. How are students evaluated at the end of their course? How is faculty evaluated at the end of delivery? And how is the course evaluated is really, really important. How people are nominated. You know, most managers would love to send the same. We have a frequent flyer problem in our training programs. The same idiots whom you want to get out of the office are nominated for the training programs because you can't spare the hardworking people. You know, we're not willing to spare the hardworking people, but it's very important. What are you trying to do in your nomination? And is your nomination for the programs done scientifically? I think the most important, and the 6th one, is the linkage of training to strategy, to promotions, postings, and transfers. If you don't do that, then you're not going to be effective in training. So the fundamental learning we've had in civil service training all over the world is that if you do not link training to promotion, postings, and transfers, it will not work. So what is delivered? Who's delivered? How is it delivered? How is it evaluated? Who is nominated? And what is the linkages to others? And the last 3, frankly, are not with training institutes, but they are with managers, right? So leaders and managers like to nominate the idiots. They don't do the evaluation of the student, and they don't sort of spare the strong people for faculty. And then they complain that the training is not effective. And then they don't use the training for posting, promotion, and transfer, right? So, Ghalib used to say, "Dhool chehre pe thi, lekin main aina saaf karta raha." So you've got to be a little careful if you keep blaming training institutes when you don't evaluate the course, when you don't nominate the right people, and when you don't make it demand-driven. But let me shift from training, because if you're going to deliver outcomes, you're going to have to think of 5 more things: strategy, structure, staffing, performance management, and tone from the top. So strategy is, what is the biggest definition of strategy? The reconciliation of unlimited aspirations with limited resources. Everybody has unlimited aspirations. We have limited resources. The Indian state needs to do less so it can do more. When Ashoka Hotel in Delhi was being built in 1955, I remember Atal Bihari Vajpayee asking Jawaharlal Nehru, "Why is the government building a 5-star hotel instead of a hospital?" And Panditji responded, "The private sector doesn't have capacity." 1903, Jamshedji Tata had set up the Taj Mahal Hotel in Bombay, which in 1945 was ranked one of the best hotels in the world. We are in Lucknow, Scooters India. When Bajaj Auto asked for an expansion of capacity, Mr. Haksar responded, "No, we will not expand your capacity. We will set up Scooters India." We can talk about Air India. There are certain areas of activity which will be very hard for the government to do. You do not have the tools, you do not have the performance management, you do not have the ability to punish and reward that we do. And there are lots of things we can't do in the private sector, but running airlines, running hotels, so putting civil servants in the position of delivering services that they are not going to be able to do is actually a birth defect. So the fundamental point of human capital in government is do less so you can do more. Structure is a really important part of human capital, the vertical versus horizontal. Japan only has 8 cabinet ministers. America only has 14. UK has 22. We have 75 ministries, 58 58 ministers. Anybody can say no and nobody can say yes is a real problem. And autonomy versus accountability is at the core of designing structures. You want to design structures where you give everybody autonomy, because otherwise you won't be able to create accountability. The other point of structures is they were meant to be pyramids. They became cylinders, but they need to go back to being Eiffel Towers. You can't have 250 people in Delhi with the rank of Secretary to Government of India. You can't have 10 people with the rank of DG Police in every state. So I think structure of vertical versus horizontals, autonomy versus accountability, and pyramid and sort of versus cylinder are really important for your training thoughts. I think staffing, 25% difference between actual strength and sanctioned strength, which exists in most. It exists at RBI. I'm on the board of RBI. It exists at CAG. It probably exists in many. It makes no sense. Either you're overworking the good people, or you're not getting work done, or you're squatting on positions. And so the 25% difference between sanctioned strength and actual strength makes training sort of meaningless. I think cognitive diversity, Aneka Antavad, it's the philosophy of Jainism, but it was one of Gandhiji's favorite words about multiple. Cognitive diversity is the only way you will get performance. And we have a lot of cognitive diversity when the kids take the UPSC exam and become probationers. But that cognitive diversity diminishes over 20, 30, 40 years. And so if you don't have cognitive diversity, you shouldn't think about staffing, and you need to think about selection. But the last and the most important one that I'll sort of remind you about is performance management. You cannot do training without performance management. If you keep Gadha Ghoda equally, it is the Gadha who celebrates and the Ghoda who gets frustrated. So you cannot rank, if you believe in a system of delivering performance, you cannot rank 98% or 99% of your people outstanding. It just makes no sense. It is you're punishing your good performers. You're not rewarding your bad performers. I think performance management will have to recognize risk-taking. We have reached the limits of the same recipe. We need more cooks in the kitchen. We need a different recipe. So a system which doesn't distinguish between fraud, incompetence, bad luck, and bad judgment is never going to have risk-taking. I lost 200 crores last year. My board thinks it was arrogance, but they don't think it was fraud. So it's important to recognize that Performance management systems will have to distinguish between fraud, incompetence, bad luck, and bad judgment if they're going to be effective. I think you have to think of an up or out system. The army does it well. The brigadier threshold or the major general threshold at 50, 52, 54. If you're not shortlisted for promotion, please move them out. They are toxic sitting there for 8 years or 10 years. These people in RBI, I chair the HR committee, which are promotable but not postable, right? Please promote him so you take him away, but don't post him with me. It's just it's very toxic for the organization, people who are promoted but not postable. So in closing, I just, tone from the top, Karma Yogi seems to be a wonderful framing, right? Because the tone from the top of efficiency, the tone from the top of risk-taking, the tone from the top of lack of corruption, and the tone from the top of differentiation are really key to any human capital regime. There has to be a fear of falling and a hope of rising in any organization. And it's not about compensation. Postings, promotions, and transfers are huge currencies available to us in government to reward and punish people. So, in closing, COVID has sort of reminded us that total GDP, we are 5th in the world in total GDP, is not as important as per capita GDP. We are 138th in the world in per capita GDP. I went for my MBA to the US in August 94. There was a front page article on the Wall Street Journal which said, India is more interesting than important. I hope that journalist is eating the newspaper on which he wrote that, right? Because what's happening in India isn't once in a decade or once in a millennium. It's really once in the lifetime of a country. But there are 300 million people in India who will never read the newspaper that they deliver or sit in the car that they clean or send their kids to their school that they help build. And, I've seen government in 4 ways. I'm the child of a civil servant, which I now realize was a sampling error. I worked in pre-reform India. I spent 15 days out of my month in Shastri Bhavan, DGT, DCCI, and we didn't have clients. We had hostages in that environment. As a startup entrepreneur, I had 742 inspections in the first 2 years of my company. But now on the other side in policy, there's nothing more frustrating than government to get things done, but there's nothing as powerful as government to get things done. And, the government has never had HR. We've never thought about training. We've never thought about performance management. We've never linked it to structure. We've never linked it to strategy. We've never linked it to that. But the inner strength of any country is government human capital. Ramdhari Singh Dinkar, one of my favorite poets and my favorite quote, Shama Shobhati us bhujang ko jiske paas garal ho. Only snakes with venom can be benevolent, kind, and generous. And the only venom we have is human capital in India. 5 million Indians this year have exported more software than Saudi Arabia exported oil. 5 million out of our 1.3 billion population. So you have to think of that on how we've done that. So essentially, I think human capital in government is really the defining project for the next sort of 20, 25 years. India at 100 is 2047. I think the binding constraint, if you think about transforming India or you think about delivering public service, will be human capital in government. And it's wonderful that the Capacity Planning Commission and others are sort of thinking about it. But you have to not reduce this project to training. You have to link it to performance management. You have to link it to structure. You have to link it to strategy. And you obviously have a new tone from the top, which will work for it. Thank you.
Can we open it up for some questions, and then we can also have a discussion amongst the panelists? So are there any comments? Adil. Can we have the mic to go that side? Mic.
Manish, it's always a pleasure to hear you. And every time I learn a lot, your phrases are wonderful and they go together. So my question was, you laid out a lot of the challenges. It would be very interesting to hear from you over your last 30 years. What are some of the successes that you have seen in terms of how government has transformed to get us to where we are? You talked about a lot of the challenges, which is wonderful, but something also went right for us to get to become important, right? Not just interesting, but important. And it would be helpful because that will give us a lesson on what can be done. So what were some of the changes you saw that worked Thank you.
Obviously, we don't live in an economy, we live in a society. We have to keep reminding ourselves, I have to keep reminding myself that. We took two reckless experiments when we were born. One was political, one was economic. The political experiment has worked out wonderfully, right? 3 million people in India win an election. The difference between India and Pakistan born on the same night is that, for somebody born and brought up in Kashmir who got his domicile only last month, that's an important reminder. I did get my domicile certificate last month. So I think we have built the world's largest democracy on the infertile soil of the world's most hierarchical society. I think that's a real important accomplishment, which teaches us, or at least is instructive for why we didn't build the world's largest economy. And I think it was the 1955 Avadi Resolution or the 1956 Second Year Plan, to which I can pinpoint the confusion in the role of what the government should do, what the private sector should do. And my case never, please don't misread me. Nobody makes the case that a good country has no government. Otherwise, Waziristan in Afghanistan or Swat Valley in Pakistan would be hotbeds of venture capital and entrepreneurial activity. I think what we did right in society, we didn't do right in the economy. In the last 10 years, I think we have finally shifted our gaze from saying that India's problem is jobs, but it is wages. Finally, a country is prosperous by the productivity of its states, the productivity of its firms, the productivity of its sectors, and the productivity of its individuals. So the formalization, financialization, urbanization, industrialization, and human capital program of the last 10 years represented a big discontinuity. Because if you think India's problem is jobs, you'll throw money from helicopters, you'll mandate a 3-day work week, you'll tell people to dig holes with spoons instead of shovels, right? Because unemployed, they'll be employed, but they'll be digging with a chammat se khodo, zindagi bhar khodte rahoge bhai. So I think that what we have done right in the last 10 years, which is manifesting itself in so many ways, the digital, I think GST is a spectacular discontinuity for India. It's a reverse Brexit. We are converting 29 countries into one economically. I think UPI, I think that represents the right mix of public-private partnership in creating a public good for the infrastructure, but leaving the innovation to the private sector. So I would just say what we've started getting better at doing in the last 10 years is swimming in our lane and being more respectful of each other's capacity. The private sector cannot substitute for the state. I can't manufacture my own employees. I can't generate my own power. I cannot provide my own transport. As a large company, even though I might be able to do it, but for 63 million enterprises in India, only 22,500 companies with a paid up capital of more than 10 crores. So I think what's gone right for India now is the shift from poverty to productivity. It's a shift from recognizing that all three of us have different roles. And I think the most important shift is just ambition.
Are there any other issues?
Manish, it's always music to ears when we listen to you. But one thing I'd think you should also elaborate financialization. The non-workers are earning more money than the real workers. So productivity and wage do not count there. Do you like to reconcile it and maybe elaborate it? Am I clear? Huh?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
So on 29 July 1969, when Indira Gandhi nationalized banks, she said, I'm nationalizing banks to give money to the self-employed, to the farmers, and to MSMEs. Un tino ko to mila nahi, right? I mean, we have 14 lakh crores or 12 lakh crores in NPAs for the last 10 years. The challenge with that, sir, is that credit to GDP ratio has been stuck at 50% for the last 15 years. I don't think 300% credit to GDP ratio, which China has, is the right number. But I think 100% credit to GDP ratio is important infrastructure of opportunity for MSMEs, for a large part of our aspirations. So when I talk about financialization, taking 50% credit to GDP ratio, we have about 140 lakh crore in deposits and about 110 lakh crores in loans. We do need to take credit to GDP ratio to 100%. Obviously, the stock market might be hormonally imbalanced today. There might be But $30 billion in private equity this year, which India is attracting, is very important for building a meritocratic India. My father was a civil servant. I could not have started India Life or Team Lease unless we had private equity. Because obviously your opening balance, I mean, all of you are civil servants and your GPF balances will not support the money I needed, nor did my dad's. But, I think the meritocratic capital of $30 billion of private equity is creating the 150 unicorns. We have created a company worth more than $1 billion every 10 days this year. It is an important part of transforming India. 50% of them will fail, but it doesn't matter. There's an old saying about stupid entrepreneurs and wise society. Every entrepreneur is stupid because he believes he'll succeed, but 80% of them will fail. But society only needs two to succeed. So I think the Cambrian explosion, which I think you worry about in the equity markets, is private equity is okay. But the one which I'm focused on, financialization, is really credit to GDP ratio, which 50% is sabotaging too many MSMEs, too many dreams, and just getting to that per capita income of $10, $12, $15,000, which we can. The JJCR of 1991 is okay, but China and India had the same per capita GDP in 1991. Now we are $2,500 and they are $12,500. I don't want to live in China. I don't want to be in China, but I do want a $12,500 per capita income.